Alright, recording. Let's begin. Good evening and welcome, families. My name is Anita Arjoyan, and I am the GATE Teacher Specialist with the Equity, Access, and Family Engagement Department. I want to start off by thanking you all for being here tonight. But before we begin, I have a disclaimer. This is my first time hosting a webinar with Google Meet. It took me a year of virtual teaching to become an expert with Zoom. I'm hoping it takes me less time to become proficient with Google Meet. So please be patient. Please be patient while we navigate the new platform. Okay, so let's start with our interpretation feature. I have pinned the live interpretation links in the chat, and I will also ask our interpreters to introduce themselves and give directions on how to access the interpretation feature. I'll begin with Ms. Vardoui, our Armenian interpreter. And Ms. Vardoui, you're muted. Okay, let's start with, in that case, Mr. Kim, our Korean interpreter.
Sure. 네, 안녕하세요. 오늘 게이트 패밀리 모임에 오신 여러분을 환영하며 저는 여러분의 이해를 돕기 위해 한국어 통역 서비스를 제공할 쌤이라고 합니다. 한국어 통역을 원하시는 분은 한국어 방 화면 아래 오른쪽에 보면 채팅룸이 있고 거기 채팅룸에 가시면 Korean Interpretation 링크가 있습니다. 이것을 클릭하시면 한국어 서비스를 받으실 수 있습니다. 통역사 소개가 다 끝나면 한국어 방으로 오시길 바랍니다. 감사합니다. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you. And our Spanish interpreter, Ms. Adriana.
Hola, buenas tardes. Si les gustaría escuchar en español la presentación, en el chat, en la cajita azul que está en un costado, cuando le hacen clic van a aparecer los enlaces de armenio, Spanish, Korean. Hacen clic en el enlace de Spanish y van a poder escuchar la presentación en español. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. And even though Ms. Vardoui can't unmute herself, I'll do my best for my Armenian families. Yetahayedeni takmamchuna betkadir hamar chat box-ում կտեսնեք գրած Armenian, Spanish, Korean. Armenian տակ link-ը սխմեք եւ կգնաք news meeting-ը, այդտեղ այս ժողովը հայերենով կլսեք. Okay, I give myself a B+ for that. All right. Thank you, our interpreters. Again, if you need the interpretation, please click on the links. All right. Good evening again, and thank you so much for attending the last GUSD GATE Family Institute. Today is Thursday, April 25th. I want to extend my gratitude to our participants, our speaker, Ms. Fonseca, and our interpreters on the Google Meet. I'd also like to establish some guidelines. I do want you to know that our meeting will be recorded and posted to our website in about 72 hours. And like I said, the Google Meet platform is new to me, so I'm pretty sure we have a Q&A option where you can put in questions into the chat. We'll do our best at the end of the presentation, should there be time, to answer any of the questions. All right, we're so happy to have our presenter, Mrs. Christine Fonseca, back here with us. We want to welcome all of our families here tonight as Ms. Fonseca discusses how we can help redefine normal for our gifted students. Mrs. Fonseca is a licensed educational psychologist, a critically acclaimed author, and a nationally recognized speaker on topics related to educational psychology, mental health, and giftedness. Previously recorded webinars can be found on our district website, and I also want you to know that I'll share the link to this recording with our site administrators and our site specialists. With that, I'd like to pass it over to Ms. Christine Fonseca. Thank you so much for being here.
Truly my pleasure. I always love coming and speaking with you guys. Give me a moment while I share my screen. And once I do so, Anita, I'm going to ask that you let me know if you can, in fact, see my slides, because I won't see you. So let's see. I know I can see you right now, but let's get this from the beginning. Can you see that?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Well, we are talking tonight about what it means to redefine normal for our gifted kids. It's been a while since I've had an opportunity to speak with the audience from Glendale Unified about what it really means to be gifted, what those specific characteristics are, and how we help normalize some of the things that can sometimes be more difficult with our gifted children, how we help them normalize some of those things that they're feeling. I have the benefit of working in my day job with gifted kids and all kinds of kids in a school at the middle school level. And I'm always surprised, although I probably shouldn't be, about how giftedness shows up in our different children, and sometimes how much for both adults and for the students, we misinterpret some of the things that we're seeing and don't always understand how much of this is related to giftedness. As I start with this, though, I want to share a little bit about kind of the story of what giftedness meant for me and why I'm so passionate in this area. I grew up as a gifted child in Pasadena Unified, your guys' neighbors practically. And I was identified gifted at a pretty young age. But what really stood out about my childhood is that I was just this really intense human being. I read at a very young age. That might sound familiar to many of you parents because I'm sure many of your children read at a young age. I actually was reading Shakespeare when I was in third grade, had dreams of putting on a Shakespearean play. I wanted to put on Macbeth with my little third grade friends. When I was about 9, I composed my first concerto. I was a violist at the time, and I conducted orchestras. I imagined ways that I could stop pollution and reverse climate change. And this was a very long time ago before we ever talked about such things. But the other truth in my life is I also grew up with a lot of trauma, and I grew up with a lot of adversity. And so I felt some really strong feelings about all of that. And I, as I grew up, tended to rely on my intellect and kind of ignore the emotional intensity that was also true and present and very normal from being a gifted child. And I've started to really kind of understand as I grew up that I needed both my intellect and my emotionality to kind of be a full, well-rounded human and to develop internal resilience and to be able to really face all of life's adversities. And I needed to learn how to embrace that emotional aspect of who I was to really be able to have the balance and the equilibrium that I was looking for. And with our gifted kids, I find that this is true for them as well. Many of our gifted children don't understand that that emotionality that sometimes comes along for the ride is a normal and integral part of what it means to be gifted. And so I think for a lot of them, there's a heartache that occurs when they find themselves overly emotional about things, and they don't always know why that's occurring. So this first little part of our presentation tonight is really going to be for us to get anchored in on what it means to be gifted. And then the second piece of what we're going to do is going to talk about how do we help our gifted students and our gifted children balance some of these different aspects of what it means to be gifted. So how would I define giftedness? Well, giftedness is more than how you perform on a standardized intelligence test. It's really a collection of traits and talents that affects all aspects of who we are, from our cognition and the way we think about things, to our personality and the way we interact with the world, to who we are as social emotional beings. It really incorporates all of those things. Let's start first with the thing most of us are most familiar with when we think of giftedness, and that's that intellectual aspect of being intense. So in our culture, we really cherish and prize intellectual intensity. We often use words like smart and innovative, creative, and successful to define a lot of our gifted kids. And while those um, attributes are definitely part of what it means to be giftedness. Sometimes when that's the only way we define gifted human beings, our gifted students hold on to those words, and there's a lot of pressure in those words, right? Being innovative, creative, successful. Gosh, what happens if you're a gifted human who maybe doesn't show up in the world that way? Does this mean you're less gifted? Of course it does not. These are just one way that we use to define giftedness. I like to think of giftedness as a coin that has two sides. And on one side are all these amazing intellectual traits. And on the other side, equally important, are the emotional aspects of what it means to be gifted. Now, some people really struggle with that aspect, but the more we get to understand what emotional intensity is and is not, and the more we start redefining what it means to our children, the more they can be better equipped to handle this other side of the coin. Now, this other side of the coin, this emotional side, at its most immature state, can often be the thing that consumes a lot of our gifted kids and helps them or creates for them the ability to engage in these self-defeating behaviors, things like toxic perfectionism or some of the other attributes, maybe extreme behaviors, especially when it comes to doing homework at home. Maybe they don't show any behaviors at school at all, but once you're home, like, oh my goodness, it feels like a different child has come home. So what are those emotional aspects of giftedness? Well, often it means very complex and layered emotions. So a kid can be very happy and miserable all at the same time, or radiate from one to the other, vacillate between these at really high rates of speed, so fast that we can't even keep up with who they are emotionally in any given moment. A lot of times for our gifted kids, this emotional intensity might show up as a physical reaction: headaches, stomach aches, heart palpitations. These are all things that happen with a very high level of frequency amongst our gifted population. It also might mean that they're deeply empathetic about everything. They may want to take on some of the world's causes, or they may have a best friend who's going through something and they'll take on all of those emotions. But really what it means is that they have this high degree of passion for everything that they do, for the entire way that they interact with life. At its mature and best and most highly developed state, all of these intensities are the passion that drives our gifted population to achieve and produce these amazing feats in almost any domain. It really is their modern day superpower. But let's think about how we tend to characterize emotional intensity in the world right now. We often define emotional intensity by really negative words. Where we called intellectual intensity things like smart and creative, innovative and successful, we might use words like overly emotional, overly dramatic, a little crazy, as ways to define our emotionally intense aspects of giftedness. And so our kids wind up growing up believing that part of who they are as a human being on the planet is fantastic and should be celebrated. But this whole other part of who they are is something that brings shame, something that they may even try to hide from the world. That's the thing we want to get away from. That's the part of normal, what normal is for a gifted kid, that we want to start illuminating and start helping our children define. So what are the basic attributes of giftedness? I like to start with neurodiversity. We are in actually Neurodiversity Month right now, as a matter of fact. Neurodiversity in common educational vernacular usually applies to students with autism or students maybe with a learning disability. But what the research really tells us is it also defines students who are gifted. And why is that? Because neurologically, the very core of their brain is somewhat different than a typically developing child. So let's talk about the ways in which it's different. First, they literally have a big brain. They have more gray matter volume in their brain than a typically developing child. What does that mean? Well, it means they have more files in their head to store information. That's part of the thing that our gifted kids are known for, right? Just having all kinds of information stored in that big brain of theirs. What I find really interesting, though, is they also have more white matter and slightly different white matter in their brain. White matter is like the connections that occur in our brain that helps make our brain efficient. And because of the way the white matter is formed in a gifted brain, along with the gray matter, they tend to have very efficient brains. This is part of the reason why some of our gifted kids can engage in a variety of different behaviors, especially in the younger grades. They might be getting very frustrated by a slow pace in the classroom or having to learn the same thing over and over and over. Even if they're not learning the same thing, they may perceive common patterns of doing things as being the exact same. So as a parent, you might be getting feedback from your child that says, oh my gosh, we do the same thing every single day in class, even though that might not be completely accurate. But to them, that pattern makes it feel the same. Our gifted children also have highly sensitive brains. What do I mean by that? I mean, they literally have sensitive brains. The way in which they interpret information coming in from the 5 senses is different. So lights really do seem brighter. Noises really do seem louder. The things that they touch and the things that they smell are more intense. If you ever wonder if this is true, think back to a time when maybe you as a parent changed your fabric softener and what your child's reaction to that might have been, or changed a brand of sock and what your child's reaction may have been. Oftentimes they are very, very sensitive to those changes, and they'll let you know through their behavior or through their words. All of these things together, though, form a brain that really has the capacity for very heightened levels of emotional intelligence. So not only do they have heightened levels of intellectual intelligence, which we'll talk about, but they also have heightened capacity to develop that emotional aspect of who they are. And because of that, they can have a very integrated brain. And a very integrated brain is basically the biology of resilience, which means they also have the capacity to develop a very, very resilient nature. So, intellectual aspects, that one side of the coin, some very typical things that we might find for the intellectual side of the house are things like intellectual curiosity. They may want to take apart all of those broken electronics around the house and remake them into something new and exciting. They may have a very rapid learning rate, especially for rote information. Again, this can cause problems in that K1, 2, 3 grades in particular, where we're not doing quite as many abstract things, but we're providing that intellectual or that educational foundation. They may have been early readers. They might be early talkers. They tend to have a very vivid imagination. And so when they're dreaming, whether it's a daydream or a night dream, it might be in full-blown movie format. They might experience really heightened imagination in their imaginative play. They tend to have very complex thought processes. So if there's a hard way to get from point A to point B, that tends to be the way they want to do it. Even in their free play, the way they just interact at home with their different toys that they might be playing with might be very complex. They may take an exorbitant amount of time to even set up that play before they even engage in that play. They tend to have very early moral concern, and they really have a passion for learning that partially defines them. Now, you noticed I wrote passion for learning. I didn't write a passion for school, because whether or not that passion for learning depends on a passion for education really kind of depends on the school and the parent's ability to kind of meet the needs of that child within the educational environment. In addition to those intellectual attributes, there are a collection of social emotional attributes that are really important and that kind of come alongside that emotional intensity, which we'll talk about. So emotional intensity is just that extreme emotions and complex layered emotions that I mentioned earlier. It's that feeling happy, happy, happy 1 minute and sad, sad, sad the next minute, vacillating between the two, or having really heightened emotional reactions when they become dysregulated, like when they maybe don't do as well on something as they thought they should have, or when they perceive that somebody has wronged them in some way. They might have a very strong emotional reaction about that. But it also means a few other things as part of their social emotional development. They might have a very strong moral maturity. And so that sense of right and wrong might develop at a very young age. Unfortunately, it doesn't always develop alongside some coping strategies to deal with some of life's nuances or some of the things in life that seem very discongruent. And so they may have a hard time adjusting to that because there's a lot of gray in the world, right? There's not a lot of black and white, but there's a whole lot of gray, and they may struggle with that nuance, especially when they're younger. Most of our gifted kids actually have very high degrees of internal motivation. Again, whether or not that translates into being highly motivated to complete your math worksheet is a very different thing. But I don't ever want you to interpret that lack of motivation to complete a memorization task as meaning they aren't internally motivated to learn. They are. They're just internally motivated to learn the things they want to learn. They tend to have a collection of high performance standards. That just means that they expect very big things from themselves. They hold themselves to a very high standard. They're not very happy with halfway. They want to do something right. And sometimes this can cause problems because sometimes the picture they have in their head of what they're trying to do and their skill development to show that to a teacher or show that on the assignment they're trying to do might be a mismatch. And when it's a mismatch, it could get them very stuck very fast. They might get emotionally dysregulated. And that dysregulation becomes extreme because of the emotional intensity. You can kind of see how all these things work together. Another typical attribute is this idea of self-actualization. So all human beings on the planet at some point in their lifetime are dealing with the question of who am I and why am I here? It's kind of the most common reason why kids might take, psychology or philosophy their freshman year in college, because they're really exploring what it means to be a human being on the planet, what they might want to do here. Well, our gifted kids are dealing with those big, big questions at very, very young ages. Most parents are very surprised when I tell them that, yes, at age 4 or age 3, they might be contemplating the meaning of their life in the universe, which is a very young age to be asking these questions. And sadly, some of how this question might come out like, why am I here, Mom? Or what's the point to life? Or even what's the point to living? And most of us as parents would be very alarmed if we hear our toddler asking those questions or our kindergartner asking those questions. And the truth of the matter is that might be normal for some of our gifted kids. Of course, we always want to explore that question with our student or a child when they're asking it, because we want to make sure they're not having other kinds of depression thoughts that are showing up. But a lot of times with our gifted population, it's really just this trying to find meaning in a universe. And we'll talk about how that relates to resiliency development in a minute. I already mentioned empathy and resiliency also as two very common social emotional attributes. In addition to these common attributes that we see, there are 5 areas of intensity that often show up in our gifted kids as well. We've actually talked about 2 of them, both the intellectual and the emotional, but those other 3 might show up in varying degrees as well. This is particularly true if we happen to be dealing with a gifted human being who also it has something else going on, like they're gifted and they have a learning disability, which seems like they can't exist together, but they do quite commonly actually. Or they might be gifted and have ADHD, or gifted and have a mental health concern or autism or something else. So I always kind of want you to think that all these things can coexist because human beings are fabulously nuanced in how they show up in the world. Psychomotor area of intensity. These are kids who like to talk for the sake of talking. They move for the sake of moving. And their preferred method of learning is hands-on through movement. Maybe they're just a big talker, and so the way they process the world is through oral communication. They might be the ones who come home and then tell you in minute detail every second of the day. So much so in minute detail that you might get lost in what they're trying to say sometimes. Our sensual overexcitability or intensity areas, those kids have particularly heightened sense of smell, sense of touch, sense of color. They can also be moved to tears by a beautiful song or a beautiful painting. Our kids with imaginational intensity, they have even more vivid imagination. They might be imagining a whole world, and it might look like they're not paying attention in class or not paying attention when you're having a conversation with them, when really all that's going on is they've gotten lost temporarily in that imaginational world. All 5 of these areas can show up with our gifted kids, although it's pretty rare to have all of it show up. Usually you just have that intellectual piece, that emotional piece, and maybe one of the other pieces show up. There's a fabulous quote that I think captures the experience of being gifted better than almost any other quote. And this is a quote by a woman by the name of Pearl Buck. And she said of the creative mind, and I would have you substitute gifted for creative in this quote, she defined it this way: a truly creative mind in any field is no more than this: a human born abnormally, inhumanly sensitive. To him, a touch is a blow, a sound is a noise, misfortune is tragedy, joy is an ecstasy, a friend is a lover is a god, and failure is death. I'm going to say that last line again: failure is death. For many of our gifted kids, that's exactly what making a mistake feels like. It feels like a type of death. And sometimes this can be so palpable and so powerful that our gifted kid may struggle to get anything done at all because they are so afraid of making a mistake. They are so dysregulated. But here's the key. If we want our gifted kids to be able to reach that potential, to be able to have that ability to kind of meet where that potential is going, then we really need to help them develop their emotional side of the house, their emotional intelligence. I always like to say that the amount of IQ you develop is completely and directly proportional to your EQ. In other words, you could be the smartest person in the world, but if you have a hard time balancing the emotional side of the house, gosh, you might have a really, really hard time being able to meet that potential at all. So let's talk about how do we meet that potential? Well, I like to look at 4 different areas, and I feel like if we look at these 4 different areas, we can really kind of get a jump up on redefining normal for our gifted kids and really strengthening their emotional capacity and helping them kind of build and develop the whole part of what it means to be them. First and foremost is connections. Not all of our gifted kids like to build connections with others. Sometimes they have a really hard time finding others who are similar to them. But connections and prioritizing relationships is a really effective and important way that we can help strengthen and build our emotional intelligence. Positive connections are really key to our resilience in general. And one of the most important things we can do is allow opportunities for our gifted kids to find and meet other gifted kids, whether it's at their school, whether it's through enrichment activities that we as parents have chosen to align our children with, in any capacity. And yes, it's important to have these connections. It's even better when those connections are with other human beings who are also gifted, young or old. Wellness. A lot of our gifted kids aren't practicing good wellness strategies. We don't have some of those foundational pieces in place. Maybe they're not getting enough sleep. Maybe they're not getting enough opportunities for downtime that's tech-free. Maybe they're not getting adequate amounts of food. I have one gifted individual I work with at school who just never drinks water, and he walks into my office almost every day, about the same time of day, with a headache and is very dysregulated because of his headache. And I remind him every day, did you have some water? Let me give you a bottle of water, so that he can drink. And sure enough, that balances him right out. But these are some things that are really important too. And when we're talking about building and developing resilience, our internal wellness is really, really important. Healthy thinking, another way of saying optimism. We know that there's a huge correlation between being optimistic and being resilient, having hope, being adaptive in our thinking. Most of our gifted kids are actually very well primed to kind of experience these things and to feel these things. But a lot of times they get stuck in that toxic perfectionism, and then they have a hard time accessing those optimistic parts of who they are. Being a family that practices looking for joys in the day. In the vernacular now, we call those glimmers. So looking for a glimmer of something to be thankful for or happy about or joyful about. Practicing some opportunities to find one thing that we're thankful for every day, starting and ending the day with these kinds of things, can help manage and balance some of the intensities that might be happening throughout the course of the day. The other thing that can really help with our gifted kids is developing meaning and purpose. What is the big thing that they want to do? And then being flexible as parents to recognize that this may change on an hourly basis. This may change on a weekly basis. This may change even as they're forming the initial idea. They may get a better idea. And just supporting our kids as they explore all these different things that might have big purpose and meaning to them certainly throughout their educational experience, but even throughout their world. Part of helping strengthen EQ too, however, is going to really lie in our capacity to help our gifted children kind of understand what it means to be gifted. If you have a gifted child at home and you haven't really sat down with them to really talk about their experience of being gifted, what they think it is, what they don't think it is, this is a great opportunity. And please consider this an invitation to invite your kid into a conversation about what it means to be gifted. Help them understand that those aspects of giftedness, that really intense emotion, feeling overly perfectionistic about everything that they're doing, that's a normal part of what it means to be gifted. And while that might be a hard part, it is a normal part, so it's something they get to learn to balance. I'm remembering a story of when my own daughter, I have 2 adult children, both of whom who are gifted. I had to go through this with them when they were growing up. And my youngest child was probably, I want to say she was in the later part of elementary school. And she was very dysregulated. Some things had been really hard at school. She was having some friendship difficulties. She was bored with the curriculum. And she just had a lot going on. And she kind of imploded one night at home. And we were sitting on her bed having a conversation. And I remember her telling me, "Mommy, can I just not be gifted now? Is that a thing? Can we just decide I'm not? Because I don't think I like it." And as we talked and she told me more about what her experiences were with being gifted, what it meant to her to be gifted, I realized that really she was looking at some of this intensity in this really negative way. I mean, you can't really blame her. It's not a lot of fun to feel things so deeply all the time, right? And it's not really fun to feel like you don't relate to some of your peers because you feel so many things so deeply all the time. So I realized in that moment that we needed to spend a little bit more time together seeing the benefits, seeing the good things of being emotionally intense. It wasn't just about getting dysregulated, but it was about the passion. And it was about being able to see things differently and see things in a bigger, more connected way than some of her friends could see them. And that sometimes that creates differences of opinion, but differences are not bad. And it took us a while of working on these things, and we had to cultivate some wellness practices, and we had to cultivate some opportunities for connection, both with peers and with, fortunately, I'm gifted as is her dad, and so we were, as is her sister, actually, and so we were able to kind of cultivate connections within our own household, and then really explore different things that had meaning for her and find opportunities for enrichment in our home setting, in our home environment, and then ways we could realign curriculum and working in partnership with our educational system. And that helped a lot. Now, as children get older, they are faced with other kinds of unique challenges. And when I work with gifted kids, especially from about 5th grade on up, these are the kinds of things that I like to share with my gifted kids. And I wanted to make sure as we close out tonight, before we have an opportunity for questions, I am leaving a good 10, 15 minutes for questions at the end here. I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about each one of these things, these challenges that I like to give my gifted families and my gifted children. Number 1, doubt everything you think. Doubt. That may seem crazy, but our gifted kids are pretty convinced they know everything about everything all the time. And darn it all, they kind of are right? They kind of have really good logic skills. They do know a lot about a lot of things, but they don't know everything. And if they don't learn how to cultivate that beginner's mindset where they're constantly being curious and they're constantly looking for new, different ways of looking at things, that only happens if we believe that even if we know all these things, that there's other things to know and there's other perspectives to things. So my challenge when I'm working with my middle school and high school gifted kids is I want you to learn how to doubt that you know what you know as being true. What else may also be true? The other thing I like to really challenge my gifted kids with is to detach from their thinking. Our gifted kids' brains are going a million miles an hour all the time. They never turn off. And so they don't know how to just be still often. And so one of the challenge I like to give my gifted kids is to detach from their thinking, to catch it when they're thinking and then let it go and see if they can cultivate that internalized piece of just being, of not really attaching to any particular thought, of just breathing in and breathing out silence. It can be really, really challenging. I'll tell you, as an adult, I recently discovered this thing called floating, which they're kind of like sensory deprivation tanks, but a little bit different. I was telling Miss Anita about this a minute ago. I love floating. And part of the reason why I love floating in this space where there's no light and there's no sound other than the sound of myself breathing, and I'm floating in this, thing, this vat full of Epsom salt, and I'm just literally just floating there for like an hour. It is an opportunity to relax in a way that I don't often find for me personally. And I my adult children, I had them try it too. They loved it as well. And it was for the same thing. It's that whole idea of detaching from your thinking for a period of time. Number 3, take risks and fail. And if any of you on this call or who listen to this call later happen to be an educator, I want you to push gifted kids enough so that they have an opportunity to fail. And parents, I want you to push your gifted kids enough so they have the opportunity to fail. This is going to require that they take a risk, that they try something that they might not be good at, or that they don't even know if they're good at it or not. And you'll notice in that bullet point number 3, it says, take a risk and fail often. See, we learn things every time we take a risk, and we learn things every time we fail. And anything of any meaning on this world was created after a failure, after we pushed ourselves beyond what we thought we could do. I often tell the story of Pixar. Pixar, I am fascinated with as a company. Disney in general, I'm pretty fascinated with because of their creative process. And one of the things that's true in Pixar when they are brainstorming new ideas for a movie or script or whatever, they have this process of doing some brainstorming and going, 300 ideas, 400 ideas, 500 ideas. And the idea behind this is it takes at least 50 ideas before you ever get to anything that's new or innovative or actually creative. Now, I want you to think about the last time, maybe in your professional life or in your personal life, that you actually brainstorm something beyond 3 or 4 ideas. None of us ever do, which is why we're constantly recycling ideas instead of coming up with something new, taking the risk to do that. Encourage your gifted kids to take risks. Encourage your gifted kids to think beyond what they think is possible. There's all kinds of creative ways you could do this, but really it's about making it safe for your kids to take a risk. Educators who might be listening to this, be willing to give your kids opportunities to take risks and fail without academic consequences for that. That teaches them the art of it. Most of our kids will not take risk and fail because of the academic consequence. We need to get away from that if we want to really train kids how to think in an innovative and creative way. And then finally, cultivating that internal silence that kind of attaches itself to number 2, which is that learning how to just be. Again, there's so much noise and so much chatter in a gifted human's brain. No wonder they get tired. No wonder they're irritable sometimes. It's because there's too darn much noise. We need to learn to cultivate and appreciate silence within our gifted kids. As we end tonight's talk about redefining normal, I'm going to share with you one of my all-time favorite quotes. This quote is by a guy by the name of Ron Siltonen, and he was an ad guy. It's often attributed to Apple and a few others, and it was in fact used in an Apple ad forever ago. I'm probably really dating myself, but here is the full quote. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits and the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as crazy, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. These are our gifted children. We need to redefine all the aspects of what it means to be gifted so they can embrace who they are and go and change the world for the better. All right. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing, come back to this screen, and open it up if we have questions, if we have thoughts, if we have comments.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try to figure out how to do that. Oh, I can turn it on. All right. I apologize that I didn't turn that on earlier. If you have a question to ask, you can post it in the Q&A, and I hope it populated your screen as an option. If not,
We'll figure. Who knows? I haven't done a Google webinar in forever.
I do want to comment on 2 things.
Sure.
Initially, you made me giggle at the image of a 3rd grader putting on a Shakespeare.
Oh yeah, okay. So I have to expand on that a little bit. So I watched a little too much Little Rascals. I'm dating myself again. When I was a kid, and I was thoroughly convinced that I could pull a group of kids together and we'd put on a play. So I lived in the dark ages growing up. We didn't have computers, and so I hand wrote scripts for people. I gave them all to my little friends. My little friends at lunch and at recess would have like pretend sword fights as they were memorizing, I kid you not, Shakespeare. whole bunch of 8-year-olds, right? Running around memorizing Shakespeare. And then in the end, we did not put on the play because my principal informed me that we needed a teacher to sponsor us. I was actually a very shy little girl. And so the only teacher I was willing to ask was my little 3rd grade teacher. And she thought I was nuts. I think she thought I was just making the whole thing up. And so she said no. And there ended my dream of putting on Macbeth with a bunch of 3rd graders. I thought it was fun. What's not to love about Macbeth? All right.
Do you see the question?
I can see it. Let me see if I can click on this and see the whole question because I saw just like a little hint of it. So let's see if I can. Can you read it to me?
Yes, it says, what's an approach to get a kid to keep going when they feel discouraged and want to quit because they don't immediately get a new concept?
Yes. So part of the reason why our gifted kids do this, and they do this a lot, it's so infuriating, right? They get dysregulated inside. They have a physical sensation, usually in the stomach area, that tells them this is bad. Their brain's interpreting that as a threat, which is why they just want nothing to do with it. And they want to flee the building as quickly as they can and switch to something they know how to do. So the best thing we can do as parents and start as young as possible with our kids is get them used to feeling uncomfortable. I know that sounds horrible because as parents, we never want our kids to feel uncomfortable, but discomfort, we have a real problem right now with kids, and our gifted kids are part of this, who do not like to feel discomfort, and no learning occurs when we feel comfortable. Learning always is this somewhat uncomfortable act. And so what I would do is look for opportunities for kids to stretch kids beyond what they think they can do on a really regular basis, so that when that happens in school, it's not a surprise. They don't just stop. In the meantime, while you're teaching that skill, if it's already happening right now, this is when you teach kids how to get used to their physical sensations inside and how to release that. So there are things like a body scan, which if you were to Google this or go onto YouTube and put in, body scan for kids, you'd find some really good videos on it that a kid can just follow along. If you have younger kids, I think Go Noodle actually has some body scans on it, but there's all kinds of ways to find it. But body scans, deep breathing, making glitter jars and kind of watching the glitter come down. Those are things that can really, really help teach kids how to kind of get back into their bodies and anchor into their bodies enough to get over the hump of not knowing how to do it. For my kids were really competitive. And if you have a competitive kid, doing a beat the clock on something more mundane or something that they really don't want to try can really help. Say, okay, you're going to try it and I'm going to try it. We're going to try it for 1 minute. That's all we got to do. Ready, go. Somebody else says, another question I see just came in.
My kid has high expectations for himself and others, therefore gets disappointed and frustrated. Do I just let him learn that's life? I do feel he is getting disconnected with school because of this feeling.
Yeah, the whole expectations thing is a tough one. So here's the thing. He's going to have high expectations regardless. That's part of a normal, natural part of being a really bright, gifted human. What he needs to learn is tolerance, right? So there's a couple of things he needs to learn. He needs to learn that not everybody operates under this high performance standards. And so some of his friends might not give two hoots about something that he thinks is critically important. They may not care that the columns on the chart don't line up. They may not care that they misspelled half the words in the project that they were doing together. And that might be a big source of frustration for the gifted child. So he has to learn a little grace with those who have different expectations from themselves. In social emotional vernacular, we call this developing social awareness. Social awareness is the understanding that I am a human and my emotions start and stop with me, and your emotions start and stop with you, and both are valid, both are of equal importance. That's a very hard concept for many of our kiddos to learn, but it is the key to healthy empathy, and healthy compassion, as opposed to the type of empathy and compassion that can be really draining or cause enmeshment or cause us to have really strong emotional reactions. So the more he can learn kind of, it's okay, let them do them, you do you, all of that's okay, it's okay. And if the expectations are kind of getting to the point where they're prohibiting or making it too hard for that student to get stuff done because they're getting very stuck in their expectations, that's when they have to you have to help them logic this out. So you're going to use that intellectual side of the brain to kind of unlock the stuckness that happened in the emotional side of the brain. Anything else popping in? Any other questions out there? While I'm waiting, I'll give you a little pro tip. This is going to sound weird and you're all going to think I'm nuts and this doesn't work, but I'm telling you it totally works. So there's a thing in the world of trauma. There's a somatic approach to trauma. Somatic just means it's of the body, that can help our brains when they get stuck. So trauma oftentimes will stick a part of our brain, the emotional part of the logical part of the brain will shut down and the emotional part of the brain will really take over. And so there's this thing that's an eye movement thing that really, really helps trick the brain and kind of unlock it. And so basically you're going to move your eyes from side to side real slow. Rhythmic, usually you can do it just about 5 times. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you'll actually look that way. So, right. You're going to keep your head straight, but you're going to move your eyes. That'll actually help resync both sides of your brain and unlock some of the stuff that gets a little locked up. If you ever doubt that, the next time you get yourself really emotionally dysregulated, like when you're driving in the Target parking lot and somebody gets you off or whatever it is, you can just try that yourself. And all of a sudden you're like a little bit more logical and you're realizing this is not a big deal. Like, let me just go about my day. Same kind of thing can happen for kids. And yes, I really do have all kinds of random advice on things.
I'd like to comment on the first question about that resilience that the kiddo needs in order to be able to move on or continue despite the potential or the lack of initial success. And as a former teacher of advanced students, who oftentimes were my gifted students, that layer of, like you said, adding the timer to like just elevate the stakes or heighten the stakes, that really does work with the kiddos where, if they're a little bit like, I'm not going to try that, or I'm not into it the second, there's a competitive, and this doesn't work for every student, because as we know, some of our students,
right, sometimes it's triggered.
Way. And, but if you know your student, your child, and that's, they do have that competitive personality that is easy, just augment to whatever activity it is that you're asking them to do.
Yep. Thank you for that. I saw a question pop up. I think it said, how much media should a middle school or high school student have? Did I get that right?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So, okay, all media is not created equal. Let's just start with that. By media, I'm assuming you mean screen time, because that's really what the issue is, more so than the media itself. And there is a vast difference between endlessly scrolling TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, whatever the kid's on, versus either making your own movie, right? Making your own media, being a content creator, or having like intellectual discussions about media with people. Those are really different things. I'm going to assume, for the sake of answering this question and not a dissertation, that we're talking about endlessly scrolling on the variety of media that most of our middle schoolers, usually TikTok, middle schoolers and high schoolers like to scroll on. And I would say, as a parent, you want them to have as little of that as possible. And the reason for that is really simple. What we're finding is that most of our middle school or high schoolers are really deficient in social problem solving skills. And part of the reason for that is they are solving problems via TikTok or Dr. Google. They're diagnosing themselves via Dr. Google instead of actually having conversations, actual oral, preferably in person, conversations with other human beings and developing the social skills and problem solving skills that happen as a result of that. And so we want our kids to be able to have more opportunities to do that than they currently have. That being said, gosh, some of those videos are funny. They're kind of fun to scroll through. Same thing on, whatever, to each their own. So that's not horrible, especially if you as a parent are kind of monitoring it, and in moderation, it's fine. It gives you, stuff to talk about with your friends, and some of that's all good. The telltale signs you want to look for is if your child is absurdly resistant to giving up that tech, then here's the thing, some tech addiction is starting to form. And tech addiction is a real thing. It has the same impact on the brain as drugs. And by drugs, I mean meth and heroin, like the big drugs. It does the exact same thing to the brain that those chemicals do in the brain. Tech can have that same impact. And so obviously you would never just randomly say, here's the liquor cabinet to your kids or whatever, right? You would never, ever do that. It's the same reason why you want to take tech in the same way. Now, the truth of the matter is tech's not going anywhere at all. And even if one platform is banned, something else is going to take its place. That's just the way of the world that we live in currently. So we have to teach kids how to monitor their own behavior and monitor how they are feeling when they're engaging in a variety of different technology. And then again, teach them the difference between positive engagement with technology, a la I'm a content creator, I'm like doing these fun activities, I'm making my Lego movies, I've made a new world on Minecraft, whatever it is, versus I'm a passive observer and just taking all this stuff in and it's slowly influencing me without me even realizing it. Hopefully that helped. I know it's not a definitive, give them 15 minutes, because it's very individualized. Well, I will give this particular slide presentation. I always provide that to the district, so I'll make sure that they have that. And if anything else comes up, she knows how to get in touch with me. I'm more than happy to answer questions. I will warn you sometimes, especially this time of year, it takes me a minute to get to them because my day job this is our busy time of year for the next month. So yeah, might take me a minute, but I will always answer.
Thank you so much. Perfect timing. Thank you so much for attending. We appreciate you taking the time this evening to be with us, Ms. Fonseca. Thank you to our families, our interpreters. I'm sad this is our last session together for the school year, but I know we'll see you again next year. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. All right, let me turn off. Thank you so much.
Of course, you have a good evening also. And later tonight,